Now, what I'd like to do is move on to the fixed hint. So let's go back to our browser and let's see what we can do with the fixed hint in the browser, and then we'll take a look at how that actually works. So probably the most common use that you'll make of the fixed hint is to have some sort of button or other control that is attached to the browser window itself rather than to the rest of the content. So take a look at this little social media almost toolbar thing I've got over here on the left hand side of my page content. Now notice what happens. I'm going to make my page a little smaller so I can thoroughly scroll the content here. Now watch what happens as I scroll. Now notice that everything moves except that little toolbar. You've probably seen this on lots of sites on the internet. And it's just a handy little feature, and you can attach to the bottom, the top, the left, the right, and basically that's where the thing that you attach there will stay, no matter how the browser is scrolled. And so that can be very handy for, again, toolbars, or as we'll take a look at, headers and footers that actually just kind of float above the content. You can do some cool effects with that. And it's actually quite easy to achieve this effect in Photoshop with the fixed hint. So let's take a look at let's see if I can find which one this is. There we go. Okay, so here's the document. And what I'm going to do is focus on this layer group here. Now, this is a convenience layer group. This layer group is not necessary. It's just convenient. So often, as you'll see, we organize things into the little layer folders in the layers palette, not because we're going to put a hint on them, just because it helps to group things together. And this is a best practice for using SiteGrinder in general, is that when you have the number of layers that a sophisticated web design requires, you will want to use as many groups as possible to help keep everything organized. Now, the important layer here is this sidebar column layer that has the fixed hint. So it's a column. You can put the fixed hint, for example, I could just put the fixed hint on this skip button, and it would cause that button alone to be fixed to the side of the browser window. And I could actually put the fixed hint on all of them. But it's a lot more efficient to create either a panel or a column that is going to be having other content within it, and all of the stuff that's within it will be fixed. So it's just more convenient to use a column, and actually can be more powerful, because if you have stuff in the fixed area that might change in size later, if you edit it with the content manager, say, maybe you have a menu and it might get more items, you'd really want to use a column, because then you could actually have, for example, a background that grows in size, and that kind of thing. So here, the sidebar image is the actual white rounded corner rectangle that has a little bit of a drop shadow on it. I'm going to unselect it so you can see what I'm talking about here. So this dim white rectangle is our column. And remember, if you don't have notice we don't have any effect on the column. We don't have a color overlay effect on the column layer here, and we don't have a background layer, so it's actually going to be invisible when we build the page. It's simply there to collect together subordinate layers that are in front of it and within its rectangle. So the first layer we're actually going to see on the built page is this sidebar layer, and the sidebar layer has a drop shadow and a stroke applied to it, and then there are other layers that happen to sit on top of it for design purposes. As long as layers are inside the fixed column, they will be fixed in place. They don't all have to be in a stack. This is purely decoration, this sidebar layer. Now, one thing you should notice is that in the browser, that little white rounded corner rectangle looks great on top of gray, on top of white, on top of blue. When it's half on blue and half on gray, it looks great. Why is that? That's because that layer, just that little rounded corner white rectangle layer, is exported with the PNG 24 compression setting, which you set in SiteGrinder. When you open SiteGrinder, as you probably know, you've got a compression panel there, and for any given image you can select what compression setting to use. PNG24, contrary to its name, can save out 32-bit images which include an alpha channel, which is just a way of preserving the kind of transparency that layers in Photoshop have. And so that's generally what you're going to want to do with the backgrounds of fixed items, because unless your page is all one color, you'll want to make sure that it looks good on top of whatever color it happens to be over at the time. If you don't do that, then, for example, SiteGrinder would have rendered the blue from this background into the drop shadow of this layer, and so that when we were over gray, we would have seen an ugly kind of blue fringe around this instead of just a perfect drop shadow. So that's an important tip for fixed elements, because fixed elements, again, will often appear over different colors on the same page. Now, one of the interesting things about the fixed hint is that you can put it on much more complicated items than just a single button. You can put it on a column or a panel, which allows you to create a new kind of, in effect, header or footer that actually floats above the content of the page and never disappears. So let's take a look at one of these. So for example, here we have a design that has a pretty complicated fixed header. Now notice it does not extend all the way to the sides. It could, but in this case the design wasn't trying to do that. So the design has some gaps here on the left and the right, but you see how everything just slides under it, and that's pretty handy. And because it's a panel or a column, I'm not sure which was used here, we've got an image button in it, we've got a text menu, we could have really whatever kind of SiteGrinder content, we could have a gallery in there if we wanted to, and so it's fixed at the top. It's fixed at the top. Why? Because in the Photoshop document, it's at the top of the Photoshop document, and I'll show you that in a second. But you can do exactly the same thing with a footer without using the footer hint. You're just fixing something to the bottom of the document in Photoshop, and SiteGrinder will figure out, oh well, this is a fixed item, it's at the bottom of the document, so that means you want to have it at the bottom of the browser window, or it's at the top of the document, so you want it at the top of the browser window. So this is a way of creating a header or a footer without using the footer hint or the new header hint. And so this floating stuff is very cool. And let's take a look in Photoshop at how that works. So this is the document that we were just working on. And there are a couple of subtle things going on here that I want to make sure you fully appreciate. When you create semi-transparent effects for a fixed element like this, like a header, you often will need to be careful with the both the compression setting, because this drop shadow here is notice this drop shadow is an ellipse. It's like the very bottom of a really huge ellipse, and so it's not being created by a simple drop shadow. This was a manually created drop shadow that gave it that cool kind of rounded effect that's so popular with the kids these days. And what we did to get that effect was not just use a layer style. We actually manually created that drop shadow and then used that as an image that sits on top of the panel that has the fixed hint, and creating this whole chunk of fixed stuff. So this fixed stuff has got subtle things going on. It's got, you know, the obvious thing, the image button, the menu, the kind of gray background here, but it's also got another image layer that's giving us this nice shadow. So let's go back into Photoshop and take that apart a little bit. Okay, so here's the panel. And just as a reminder, when a panel doesn't have a background color applied to it, and when it doesn't have a associated background layer to give it a tile, then it's invisible. It's not going to appear on the built page. It's simply there to collect these other layers that are in front of it. So here we have our header image, which is actually the gray stuff and the kind of drop shadow rendered into it, but it's not a tile or anything like that. This is just a nice semi-transparent layer that was manually created in an image layer. Then we have the menu, and then we have the logo. So it's the fact that this panel is both going to be invisible because it doesn't have the color overlay layer style applied to it, and it doesn't have an associated background layer named after it. So that means it's going to generate no image or anything like that. It's just going to collect these other things that are within its rectangle and in front of it. And then because this is a semi-transparent image, it's going to be nicely semi-transparent on the page because it's set to a PNG 24 compression setting. If this were not set to PNG 24 inside SiteGrinder's compression panel, it would not work quite so smoothly. You would see a sort of a halo of pre-rendered bluey gray riding on top of everything. If you want to have a panel that has a background that extends all the way to the edges of the browser window, then you make your panel extend all the way to the edges of the browser window, and you give it either a color overlay layer style or you give it an associated background, which this does not have. So for example, let's go to another. So this is a slightly simpler situation. This is a footer, and notice it's also floating. So the text is going underneath it as I scroll. But notice it also extends all the way to the edge of the browser window. So no matter how wide or narrow the browser window is, it's going to have this wide sort of maroon band that will float. So if you've used SiteGrinder much at all, you've probably used a browser background that goes all the way across the document, or a footer background layer that goes all the way across the document and therefore extends to the edges. This is exactly like that, only without the footer hint. It's just something the fixed hint does automatically with panels or columns that extend all the way across the document. SiteGrinder just assumes, oh, well, you're going to want that to go all the way across the browser window too, so I'll just handle that. So basically it's just like the footer hint that we've had before, only it now has this magical property of floating above everything and never leaving the visual area of the browser window, no matter how it's scrolled. So that's kind of the next thing I was going to show about that, so we're done with that. This shows a very similar effect, only what I've got here is a drop shadow that goes all the way across the browser window. So watch when I scroll under it. The text gets shadowed also. So we see that that's actually a live semi-transparent tile going all the way across the top of the document. So so let's go ahead and look at this in Photoshop and see how that works. So this is a pretty advanced example. Now, please be aware, all of the examples that I'm showing you are available for download from the documentation wiki. So if you want to take this apart yourself and take a look at how it's if you want to achieve this effect, I highly recommend downloading one of these sample files that is the closest to the effect you're going for, and then trying it yourself. So let's look at this file in Photoshop. So we've got